afterwards. After we listen to the 105 voices of Lift Every Voice and Sing, we're going to have the pleasure of hearing from Mr. Jonathan Jones. Jonathan Jones is the manager of youth and family programs at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. For the last 9 years, he has helped create and implement educational programs and content about and around the African diaspora for schools, corporations, and community groups. Having studied political science at Michigan State University and applied drama and theater for the young at Eastern Michigan, Jonathan is an avid advocate for marginalized, underserved, and often unheard communities. If you've ever wanted to know why we celebrate Black history in the month of February, how the celebration started, and why it is essential to protect and preserve history, join us as we listen to Mr. Jonathan Jones have a great discussion. And I will say, a few weeks ago, we had the opportunity to go to the African American Museum, and we had two tour guides. Jonathan was my tour guide, and he was absolutely phenomenal in how he took us through the continent of Africa all the way over to American Black history. So I look forward to his words today. So after we hear from the 105 voices of Lift Every Voice and Sing, the next voice you will hear will be that of Mr. Jonathan Jones. Thank you. So you don't have to stand up. Let's sit down and enjoy. All three verses.
That was kind of amazing. It wasn't just me. That was amazing. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Jonathan Jones. I am the manager of youth and family programs over at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History. Thank you all for having me here today. I'm not going to be before you very long. Today, we really just want to talk about history. Like I said, I work at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, and a question I get often, particularly in this month, is why do we need to celebrate Black history? Well, one of the core principles that Dr. Wright was espousing when he founded the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History was that if you don't know your past, you can't really operate in your present. If you can't operate in your present, you can't truly excel into your future. The question is, if we're human beings, we want to be fully realized human beings, right? Actualizing and maximizing our fullest potential. And the best way to do that is to occasionally take a moment to look back and see where and how far we've actually come. That's why it's so important for everyone to know their history. But the real question is, what is history? Now, history is the study of past events, and more specifically, a whole series of past events that are connected to someone or something. Everything from when someone was born to when something was discovered becomes a part of history. In other words, when we speak of history, we speak of the summation of all that has come before and has shaped where we are. So why is that important? Well, without understanding what has come before, we can't have a true appreciation of what currently exists, nor will we have full access to all the resources and the best methods for successfully moving forward. We must protect our history. So what does that mean? What does it mean to protect? Well, simply put, it means to keep safe, to preserve or guarantee someone or something from hurt, harm, or danger. But when it comes to history, there is another level to it. It's not just about making sure that what is protected is preserved, but it's also ensuring that what is preserved is not perverted. We have to not just know what happened in the past, but we have to know it accurately. It's important for us to recognize that everything that has happened up until this point impacts each of us, whether it be directly or indirectly. Okay, here's a simple example. If any of you have ever seen the movie The Mummy, came out in like the late 90s, early 2000s, and stars Brendan Fraser, and then he's a rugged bad boy, and he's supposed to be helping this nerdy white girl played by Rachel Weisz, and she's like, oh, I know about ancient Egypt, and I want to know about this lost city, and so he's like, I'll take you, and we'll go on this adventure together, and while they're on this adventure, they encounter the villain of the film. Now, this is this old, evil Egyptian sorcerer who wants to kidnap the girl and use her to bring back his ancient love. Now, with all the skills and determinations and the luck, They defeat the evil sorcerer, rescue the girl, ride off into the sunset with all the money and all the love. And it's not a great movie, but it's pretty good. It's cute. Here's the issue that we run into. When you're talking about the evil sorcerer of the film, the character is named Imhotep. Now, the character was actually based on a real life Egyptian person, but he wasn't a sorcerer. He was actually a mathematician. He was actually an architect. He was actually a high priest. And it's not terribly shocking that Hollywood would use his image as a sensationalized version to make the movie. I mean, that literally happens all the time in movies. The issue is there's no context given to this being a fictionalized version of a real person. So if you aren't a person that ever studied ancient Egyptian history, but you have been watching movies since 1932 when the original Mummy came out, then the only thing you're going to know about Imhotep is that he's an evil guy that needs to be destroyed. The reality of Imhotep is that he was a brilliant Black engineer that actually designed and built the step pyramids of Djoser. See, we often model what we see, and that is often amplified when we have an opportunity to see ourselves in what we see. I mean, there's not too many people in the world that want to see themselves as the villain of the story. But if you're seeing yourself as an essential figure that was creating lasting world wonders, yeah, you might want to resonate with that character. We are way more inclined to be investing ourselves, our time, our families, our communities into things like STEM fields and activities when we've seen what has been done in the past by someone that looks more like us. We say protect history because history without context or accuracy is just as bad and potentially more dangerous than not knowing history at all. So let's jump ahead a couple thousand years to around the 1600s, because that's when we usually pinpoint the start of African-American history, right? 1619, knowing where we came from. I mean, that is when the United States really got it started. And we often hear in this country, well, you know, Black history is for Black people. And don't get me wrong, it is. But it's not just for Black people. See, Black history doesn't exist in a vacuum. Everything that has affected Black people in this country has impacted everyone in this country and beyond. So here's an example. At the same time that the Enlightenment reforms were sweeping across the continent of Europe, restricting the practices of torture, promoting religious toleration, and even advocating for the education of women, enslaved labor producing rice, tobacco, cotton, sugar were all emerging as the most profitable businesses in North and South America and in the Caribbean. Now, this made it easily justifiable for plantation and business owners and shippers and lawmakers to outlaw things like the right to read and write, or even be considered a human being when you're a person of African descent throughout the 16, 17, and 1800s. Now, while those Enlightenment ideas did help to get the transatlantic slave trade abolished in the United States in 1808, the domestic enslavement did continue for almost another 60 years. Now, were those European nations directly affected by the treatment of the enslaved in the Caribbean and the United States? Well, not that they divested from the slave trade, but thanks to the quality and the use of the products that were being produced by those laborers, those in Europe and everywhere else in the world were certainly still impacted. All right, so that example might be a little too far removed. So let's think about it this way. You meet somebody that was born and raised in the city of Detroit. A lot of times you're going to hear them say that their people came down from the South, right? We're talking about places like Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, the Carolinas. Now they'll say this is why they're so hospitable. They'll say this is why they can cook, why they can sing, why they love the heat. I personally do not love the heat. I hate being hot. But these are facts. The question is, how did the family get here if they're all from there? Most likely it was through the Great Migration that started around 1910. Now, the migration was due in equal parts to moving towards opportunities that were existing in the North, like working at Ford Motor Company in the factory, and moving away from oppression that was happening in the South, like the Black codes, the Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, lynchings. So why do we focus on 1910 and not 1866 when slavery was officially abolished? What caused those opportunities to emerge in places like Detroit and Chicago and New York? Dual circumstances, innovation and circumstance. You have the invention and popularization of the automotive assembly line, which is innovation, And you have the outbreak of the First World War causing factory worker shortage, which is circumstance. But why would that matter today? Well, think about it. We live in the year 2022, and when we think about Detroit, a lot of people outside of the city don't think of it as the city of promise. They don't think of it as the land of hope and opportunity. But in the reality, we are only 1, 2, at most 3 generations away from the people that did. We're talking about the people that made that journey. We're talking about our parents, we're talking about our grandparents, we're talking about our great-grandparents that used the skills that they had been learning and perfecting for years to build their homes, to build their neighborhoods, to build their communities like Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. Defining a new legacy for those that came after. So knowing this helps to bring a deeper connection and appreciation to those from the city, no matter where they find themselves today, and does help to drive the restoration of that idealism. We have more pride when we know where we came from. Somebody like Carter G. Woodson understood this. Now, he is known as the father of Black history. Now, he was born in 1875, and that is just 10 years removed from Black enslavement in the United States. And he was from Virginia, so he experienced the hardships of the deeply segregated South firsthand. And despite the fact that his parents had been born enslaved, they were illiterate, that they were such a financially poor household that he actually had to miss a lot of his primary education to help work the family farm, none of that quelled his excitement that he had for education. Even though he had to work in the coal mines that kept him from attending high school at his average age, he was still able to go back at the age of 20, earn his high school diploma. Then he went on to get his bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Chicago. Then he went on to get his PhD from Harvard University, and he was only the second African-American to ever do so, right after W.E.B. Du Bois. So even while living in a time when everything from the water fountain he could drink from to the schools that he wasn't allowed to attend was being controlled by outside forces, Dr. Woodson still achieved the understanding that the legacy of his people was more than what his physical eye could see. That there is a totality to being human that doesn't depend on your skin color. That while there is sadness and hardship and detriment, there's also greatness, there's also light, there's also hope, and there is all of that existing within your lineage. So he recognized that how Black people were treated in this society isn't the way it has to be. He had the revelation that if he didn't take an active role to help his people know and understand their own power today, the dream of a better tomorrow could never exist. So what does he do? In 1926, he starts Negro History Week. He wanted people to know that it's not just Negro history, but he wanted them to know that there are Negroes in history, that they matter as well. He chose the week that celebrated the birth of 2 key figures in the struggle for equality for African Americans. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, February 12th, and Frederick Douglass, one of the most prominent figures in African American history ever, February 14th. See, thanks to the efforts of people like Dr. Woodson and those that carried on the legacy after him, many of us today are just as familiar with the accomplishments of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the life and legacy of Malcolm X, the stance taken by Rosa Parks, the journey and courage of Harriet Tubman, as we are with things like George Washington had wooden teeth, Ben Franklin flew a kite, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. But when we start to leave out aspects of our history, we start to leave out the totality of who we are and how we got here. Yes, we know Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, but how many people were aware that if it wasn't for Lewis Latimer creating the light filament, the light bulb wouldn't have worked? These things are all factors that matter, that all have to be acknowledged. See, when you have those connection points that we find in these stories, they make them matter to us as individuals. And that helps us all to recognize that even though this ancestry does include those that were enslaved cotton pickers and sugar caners, it also includes those that were architects, mathematicians, scientists, engineers, kings, queens. So we set aside the month of February with an understanding that it is important to acknowledge all of it. So the question is, how did we go from Negro Week to Black History Month? That's actually really simple. When the idea of Negro Week started to take off, there were celebrations popping up all over the country. There were parades, there were festivals. And so some of the educators at Kent State University, as well as the Black United students, decided to expand the idea to incorporate the entire month of February. That started in 1970. A fun fact, since 1976, every last president that we've had even the ones that you might not like, have acknowledged February as Black History Month. So again, the question is, why is it important? Well, it's like Winston Churchill once said, those who did not learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And while that is true, I would actually take it a step further. I would say that there are two things that come from knowing our past. What things that we can build on and what things we can avoid. This is why it's important for us to protect our history. The reality is very simple. You can't really know where you're going until you know where you've been. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jones. Let's give another round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that educational perspective of and history lesson of how Black History Week turned into Black History Month. And I will tell you that my third grade son at Bates Academy did a living museum, and he was Lewis Lattimore. So he was dressed up in a little bow tie. He had his STEM kit with him, and it was the cutest thing because we have to teach our babies early. So thank you again, Mr. Jones, and we look forward to seeing you at